Okay.
Yeah, we definitely should. Right.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Michael Pelias with the Institute for the Radical Imagination, and we're beginning our end of 2025 speaker series. And I'm here to introduce my very good old friend, Miguel Vatter. We've known each other since the late 80s, so long history together. I'm pleased to bring him here. He's on a fellowship at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, where he gave, I think, a similar paper. Yeah, similar paper. So we're delighted that the underground is able to, undercut Princeton here, and we share this with the people, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah. So anyway, Miguel is the author of now 2 books on Machiavelli. Books on political theology. You can add, of course, to the list a very long list of books and publications. A first-rate scholar, and as I say, a very old and dear friend. He's been involved in Centers for Biopolitics when he was in Santiago, Chile. Is currently located in Australia at Deakin University at the Institute for Politics, right? If I'm not mistaken. And today he'll be giving us something very interesting, which we, do sometimes with our philosophical investigations, a kind of meta approach, if you will, to where we are globally, right? Where we are politically today in a very advanced sense. I hope it opens up many questions and many, ideas to discuss afterwards. So he's going to give his paper called Pulling the Emergency Brake in the Anthropocene, Progress or Return. And he can, of course, elaborate on what he means by progress and, of course, return and where we are. So I welcome him. Thank you so much for being here. And
thank you, Michael.
We'll let you read your paper, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So that's the way we're going to proceed. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Institute for the Radical Imagination. This is an experimental piece. I hope it's, I don't know how radical you find it. I hope it's imaginary, right?
Okay.
So I'll read it. It's, probably 40 minutes. So thank you for your patience. So the first section is World History after Gaia. What does philosophy of history look like in the Anthropocene? If we take into account the awareness of the human species as an impersonal and unconscious geophysical force that is intruding into our planet's capability to maintain its homeostatic condition. The current fashion of inscribing human history within a cosmic deep history is symptomatic, I think, of an ongoing shift from a global conception of world history towards a planetary one. Global history is tied to the idea of progress through empty linear time and striated space. And this view of time and space, as I discussed below, is profoundly determined by a Christian conception of history. We can date the emergence of the global mindset to the nautical circumnavigation of the Earth with Columbus and Magellan. It is from the viewpoint of the Western early modern navigator that the Earth as a globe was quote unquote discovered, mapped out, conquered, and colonialized, giving rise to the modern world of capitalism. The condition of possibility of this globalization is a break with what Walter Benjamin calls an ecstatic contact with the cosmos that had characterized pre-modern and pre-Christian peoples. The modern cosmovision brought the infinite emptiness of the post-Copernican conception of astronomical space to bear down on Earth, furnishing maps of the planet that literally contain white spaces. That is, spaces deemed empty and over which white Europeans could play finders keepers. Much before the Apollo mission that photographed the Earth from space, the spaceship perspective conceived of nature as an alien and menacing exosphere into which Europeans would only venture out within capsules or endospheres like ships and then airplanes. Climate change is forcing us to become reacquainted with the ancestral conviction that absent an ecstatic contact with cosmic elements, life on Earth is unsustainable. In the second part of the paper, I shall suggest that the revolutions in natural science starting in the late 19th century are perhaps unconsciously seeking to reestablish this contact. For Western Marxism, the idea of natural history is of particular importance. That history is naturalized, in fact, helps to explain not only reification and alienation, but also why emancipation never arrives. Frederick Jameson famously put it, and you know this quote, someone once said that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Now, Benjamin and Adorno, for their part, believed that revolution could only happen when nature is reconceived as history. So not the naturalization of history, but when nature is conceived as history. My hypothesis is that the ongoing reorientation of philosophy of history from a global to a planetary default setting illustrates this becoming history of nature. We'll argue that thermodynamical speculations around the concept of entropy, that is the idea that in closed systems, there is an irreversible tendency to move from order to disorder associated with the dissipation of heat. But this concept of entropy can help us grasp this planetary reorientation of politics. Dipesh Chakrabarty has claimed that the planetary boundary parameters of human existence in the critical zone of the planet are maintained for us by an Earth system, what he calls, and other people call Gaia, and that Gaia maintains these boundary parameters of our existence independently of capitalism or socialism. This may be so, but it still remains a question for philosophy of history to determine what the specific difference between capitalism and communism can mean in relation to our new planetary awareness. Now, the Anthropocene marks a point of inflection for the ideology of unlimited progress. Two well-known citations illustrate how a planetary imaginary serves this late modern critique of progress. The first citation comes from Nietzsche. It goes like this. Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe, which is dispersed into infinite twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever animals invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history, in quotations. But nevertheless, it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever animals had to die, end quote. Note how Nietzsche's deflation of the whole Enlightenment ideal of progress is framed by the spatial and temporal irrelevance of humanity compared with the infinity of the universe. Crucially, Nietzsche's text makes an implicit reference to the idea of entropy, which in the late 19th century was believed to entail the heat death of our solar system and eventually of the whole universe. Can you show the first slide, please? Apologies for the Elon Musk citation, but there you see, it's still going around in California. Along with the discovery of evolution, in fact, the second principle of thermodynamics provided one more scientific proof that the universe could not have been created by a benevolent and providential God. Entropy and the death of God, that is Nietzsche's idea of the death of God, fit together like hand and glove. Now, the second citation comes from Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history. No, it's fine, leave it there. Thanks. Quotation. This is a quotation embedded in a quotation. So this is, Benjamin says, quote, in relation to the history of organic life on Earth, writes the modern biologist, the paltry 50 millennia of Homo sapiens constitutes something like 2 seconds at the close of a 24-hour day. On this scale, the history of civilized humankind would fill only 1/5 of the last second of the last hour. Benjamin closes the quote, and then he says in his own words, the present, which, as a model of messianic time, comprises all of human history in an enormous abridgment, coincides exactly with the stature which the history of mankind has in the universe. End quote. You can show the next slide. This idea of Benjamin is it working?
Yeah.
No, all the way to the left, Jeremy. It's a very sense, all the way to the left. To press, no, to the left, to your left.
Oh, my left.
Right,
Sorry.
down on the left, yeah. Down with the left. And from the slide to the left.
Okay, I can't.
You want me to do?
Sorry,
Okay,
Miguel.
it's okay.
No, bro.
You can use
Let's
the arrow.
see if I got it.
Yeah, you can do,
No,
no, the other
yeah,
way.
the other way.
Okay, here's the next
You're
slide.
right. Thank
Anyways, this is, you can see these everywhere, right? But this gives you a 24-hour a picture of the whole history of the universe. And at the very end, the last second, there comes, our sort of history. It's become a very popular representation of cosmic history, but Benjamin was the first one to thematize before we had these things. So like Nietzsche, Benjamin employs the deep history of the universe in order to put into perspective human world history. But here, this planetary perspective offers a way to visualize how the entirety of human history could be telescoped into a messianic idea of the present, what Benjamin then called the time of the now, or the Jetztzeit, which is a time of revolutionary action. So these two citations frame the central questions for my talk. What is the relationship between cosmic time and the messianic time of revolution? And can this relation help us to think about the real nature of the difference between capitalism and communism? My hypothesis is that these relationships can fruitfully be conceived in terms of the idea of negative entropy on the one hand and the ideal of eternal recurrence on the other. Both negative entropy and eternal recurrence must be understood as expressing certain mathematical scientific principles, but at the same time, also political theological principles. Since Engels' anti-Düring, the Marxist tradition has recognized the significance of entropy because in many senses, thermodynamics was the science of industrial capitalism, symbolized by the steam engine, and it's in fact where we start the so-called great acceleration that initiated the Anthropocene. But you may ask, what does eternal recurrence have to do with capitalism and with communism? Now, in the unpublished notes to his thesis on history, Benjamin wrote the following, quote, Marx said that revolutions are the locomotives of world history, but maybe they are something entirely different. Maybe revolutions are the way in which the human species traveling on this train grabs for the emergency brake, end quote. When Benjamin voiced the idea of revolution as a sudden arrest of historical progress, it was considered absolutely marginal within the Marxist-Leninist movement because most socialists and communists held on to the belief that modern revolutions, the scientific, the industrial, the information revolution, etc., were the midwives of social progress. Today, in our age of climate change, most of us are convinced that, in fact, the train of world historical progress is about to run off a cliff. So everybody kind of agrees, it's not a bad idea to pull on the emergency brake. But I want to suggest that the thought of eternal recurrence serves as this emergency brake. Before I try to work through this hypothesis, I do need to take a detour through political theology. The reason for this is that the genre of philosophy of history is intimately tied up with a Christian conception of history. This fact, of course, has been registered even by contemporary communist theorists like Badiou or Zizek and Agamben, who, as you know, all adopt a Pauline, that is a messianic vocabulary, Christian messianic vocabulary, to speak about revolution. That's not where I'm going. Marx himself, of course, often employed messianic language. And furthermore, theological vocabulary is omnipresent in debates by scientists on climate change. They speak of an ongoing ecological apocalypse, and the scientific community periodically warns us that, quote unquote, the time that remains, which is the polar category, to humanity is rapidly running out. If we pay attention to this theological register, it's like as if the Anthropocene has really actually brought us right back around to that saddle time between the Roman civil wars and the advent of Christianity, in which the expectation of a savior, the end of the republic, and the start of empire were all fatally, I would say even astrally, interconnected. It's all as if during the past 2,000 years, we have been living in a stretched out, eternal present, a quote unquote secular time cut off from the ancestral past, and therefore actually without any real future. This section is called Jesus Christ Superstar and Mother Mary Stella Maris. That means this marine star, the sea star. In a late reflection on history, Carl Schmitt reasoned that, quote, all human beings who plan and attempt to unite the masses behind their plans must engage in some form of philosophy of history. They accept the existence of the means of extermination which modern science provides to every person in power, end quote. This is especially true after Oppenheimer. Still, Schmitt muses, the modern scientists, Oppenheimer, for example, cannot really provide answers to the question that these political mass leaders need to be answered. Namely, what kind of people can be reasonably exterminated? Schmitt goes on, only a philosophy of history can provide that answer because, quote, any faith of the masses is only the faith to be in the right, while the opponent is the one who got it wrong, because time, the future, and progress work against the opponent, end quote. Now, Schmitt wrote these quite stunning lines when he was discussing Karl Löwitz's well-known book, Meaning in History. Löwitz's central claim was that modern progressive philosophy of history are actually the result of a secularization of the Christian history of salvation. Strikingly, if you know the book, Löwitz represented his argument by inverting linear chronology. So the book starts by considering late modern conceptions of progress and moves backwards through time to end with the doctrines of the earliest Christian community. What does this mean? Well, it means that Löwitz and Schmitt shared the same suspicion, namely that what happened in the 20th century somehow showed us that we were stuck in an earlier period, precisely the period in which Rome transitioned from republic to empire, Jesus Christ was born, died, and resurrected, and the universal church was established as the stand-in for the city of God on earth. Now, why is this period so significant for the meaning of Western philosophy of history? And thus, if we follow Schmitt's argument, why is it so significant for world politics in the age of weapons of mass destruction? The obvious answer was the rise of fascism and Nazism in the 20th century. For fascism and Nazism set out to establish new empires on a Roman key, so to speak, but they were anti-Christian or neo-pagan or Aryan models, the same that Julius Evola, the famous fascist theorist, termed pagan imperialism. And it's no coincidence that World War II came to be seen by the victors as a quote-unquote just war in a very Christian sense of the term, which is ultimately conducible to a war against the Antichrist. In case Hitler, you have a different persuasion, Stalin, you can pick your Antichrist. Now today, both the neo-fascist and the anti-fascist discursive spaces are rife with speculations about impending civil wars, the end of democracy, the rise of new emperors, and who is to play the role of the restrainer the catechon of the Antichrist. The Antichrist here being whoever pervades disorder and anarchy under the mantle of establishing world peace. You could put the next slide, please.
Just use the arrow.
Just go to the arrow and then go all the way to your left on the.
There.
Okay, thanks,
Well,
buddy.
there you have where we are at today.
This is where we're
Right?
at.
On the left, we have Peter Thiel's latest lectures in San Francisco on the catechon. I kid you not. And on the right, my right, we have Trump. Well, he's bringing world peace, right? So this is just to situate you in this space. Now, Schmidt's hypothesis is very radical. He says that the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the condition of possibility for all Western forms of philosophy of history, including the Kantian and the Hegelian ones. And I'll say why. For the Roman emperors, who were born after Christ, the Christian messianic discourse offered a neo-pagan vision of a golden age that the emperor, who conceived themselves as a sort of son of God, could restore by imposing a Roman peace, Pax Romana. The birth of Christ, though, is equally significant, says Schmidt, for progressivist thinking, which infers the spiral-like augmentation of an ever more perfect time. That would be our bourgeois ideas of progress. Last but not least, quote, the eschatological thinking infers from the advent of Jesus the expectation of the immediate end of history. Schmidt thereby refers to the Pauline form of messianism that not only underlies our friends like Zizek and Agamben and so on, but of course, more importantly, underlies all forms of religious fundamentalism. So its current world historical significance, whether we're talking about the Shiite, the religious Zionist, and the evangelical forms, I don't think needs more belaboring. Now, however, Schmidt's argument is complicated by the recognition that none of these three forms of secularizing the advent of Christ expresses actually the true significance of Christianity for philosophy of history. So none of them, neither the progressivist, nor the imperial, nor the fundamentalists actually capture, according to Schmidt, why Christianity is so essential for philosophy of history. Now, why? Well, that's because for Schmidt, the significance of Christianity for thinking about history lies in the fact that, as he says, if one is a true Christian, it really makes no difference in what historical period one is living, because one is always a contemporary of Jesus Christ, newborn. Quote, Christians have to elevate the parallel between their historical times and Jesus' epoch to the level of an identity, because for them, the essential events of the Christian age, namely the advent of the Messiah, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of the Son of Man, remain alive in immutable presence, end quote. All true Christians, in other words, must be born again to one and the same life of Jesus. So Schmidt argues that Christianity is best conceived as, quote, one historical event of infinite, non-appropriable, non-occupiable singularity. And this event is symbolized by the incarnation in the Virgin Mary. Through the events of the birth, life, and death of the Son of God, Christians, he says, quote, find a basic reason and an archetype to uncover the dark meaning of their history. Now, in other writings, Schmidt expounds on what he calls the Marian conception of history. This idea of history has one axiom, a fundamental axiom, namely that nothing ever repeats itself in history. The birth of Christ through Mary symbolizes the advent of the radically new. It is a miracle that breaks with the fate that previous peoples thought were determined by the stars. This event ties human freedom to a savior whose abode, whose place, lies beyond the visible cosmos. Hence, Jesus Christ, superstar. He's above the stars. Now, Schmidt was convinced that this Marian vision of history provided the foundation for the modern, globalized vision of world history. So there is no globalization without Mary. He proclaimed that the so-called discovery of the so-called New World was, in fact, the last great heroic act of the European people. That is, the advent of globalization. And he argued that the heroes of the Conquista did not accomplish their mission as pirates, as some kind of commercial enterprise, but, quote, in the name of the redeemed Christ and his holy mother, Mary. And you can put the next slide. There you see Columbus arriving on the shores, bearing the Christ. Christopher Columbus recalled himself as the bearer of the Christ, which you can interpret in different ways, but Mother Mary is also the bearer of the Christ. And there she is on the right, beautiful Mother Mary, Stella Maris. Peter Sloterdijk connects this conception of Mary with the technology of endospheres, through which the Christian West conquered the pagan and polytheistic peoples of what today we call the global South. The European ship, in fact, was, quote, the mobilized nest or the absolute house, a homeostatic dream machine that can be steered through the outer element of the seas like a manipulable great mother, end quote. What he's referring to is, of course, that Mother Mary was the protector of Western explorers and sailors. And why? Well, because the symbol of Mary meant that when explorers and sailors encountered strangers, the motifs of possible, generic, and cultive commonalities between discoverers and discovered could be foregrounded. In other words, Mother Mary is the beginning of multiculturalism. No coincidence that globalization and freedom of religion are so closely connected from its inception and remain so. Okay, so now let me take a leap into a completely different astral or planetary conception of world history, which I hope will lead me to say something about communism. The second point. Thanks for your patience. I hope you're still following.
Great. Mother Mary's with us.
Okay, so from the belief in history as characterized by one event that opens up past and present in a secularized way, and the uniqueness of everything that happens in history, we're going to move to a different stellar constellation. I mentioned at the start that by the end of the 19th century, the second law of thermodynamics was thought to have laid to rest not only the idea of God as creator, but also modern philosophy of history understood as a secularized form of Christian history of salvation. The irreversible progression from heat to cold, from orderliness, randomness,
Is it time for your defeat? Yeah.
appears to leave no room for hope in some form of divine salvation. And the paradox is that this was also a period of enormous revolutionary energies. Communists and anarchists at the end of the 19th century embodied what they thought were secular, but still messianic, secular and even atheistic, but still messianic hopes for mankind. Hannah Arendt concludes her last book, The Life of the Mind, exactly on this puzzle. Why was it that all modern atheistic revolutionaries saw in nature and its cyclical sempiternity, she says, a refuge from the onward march of time, a refuge from the vertical, rectilinear direction of history? And she goes on, why was it that these revolutionaries, quote, whose sole intent and purpose was to change the whole structure of the future world and create a new world order, why were they so keen not to move forward, but to go back to the distant past of antiquity? These are actually Arendt's basically last words. She then died. Never wrote the third part of The Life of the Mind. Clearly, these revolutionaries were convinced that if there was any future to be had from history, this would not come as a result of progress in linear time, but precisely through another kind of future associated with a recurrence of the past. So the Christians believe the past cannot recur. Modern revolutions don't. It is striking, Arendt continues, that the notion of the future, precisely a future pregnant with final salvation and bringing back a kind of initial golden age, should have become popular at a time when progress had come to be the dominant concept to explain the movement of history. And the most striking example of the resilience of that very old dream of the golden age is, of course, Marx's, she calls it fantasy, but it's an imagination of a classless and warless realm of freedom as prefigured in original communism. Now, Arendt intuited the relevance of thermodynamics for Marx's philosophy of history. She goes on, what actually disposed of the entropy principle for the revolutionaries of the 19th and 20th century was less Engels' scientific refutation than Marx's turning, and of course Nietzsche's also, to a cyclical time concept when the prehistoric innocence of the beginning finally returns, no less triumphant than the second coming. So it's very striking here that she's opposing eternal recurrence to a Christian messianic thing and saying, well, Marxist revolution, you have to be on the side of the eternal recurrence and not on the Marian side. I think Arendt is right on here, that the doctrine of eternal recurrence does express an alternative messianic conception of time that seeks to replace the Christian one. But rather than appealing to a hoary sempiternal cyclicity, she should have instead referred to the arguments about entropy that were being developed within the discourse of thermodynamics in the 19th and 20th centuries, all of which turned on the idea of recurrence or repetition as the matrix for a radical moment of difference. Now, can you put the next slide, please? No one better than Auguste Blanqui, the most famous communist insurrectionary of the whole 19th century, according to Marx, exemplifies the communist argument for eternal recurrence. Imprisoned in a tower in Normandy at the start of the Paris Commune, Blanqui penned the first known modern treatise on eternal recurrence called L'éternité par les astres, Eternity Through the Stars. Blanqui's reasoning in his prison cell started from the recent results of Laplace's spectral analysis of starlight, of stars, which determined at the time that all the matter in the cosmos consisted essentially in 64 elements. Now we have a few more, but the principle remains the same. He reasoned that if a finite set of elements in a finite number of combinations make up the physical state of every part of the universe, then in an infinite number of iterations, these elements will eventually have to recombine themselves in exactly the same way, not only once, but an infinite amount of times, in order to fill out the infinite space of the universe. Blanqui thus anticipated the way many physicists today account for parallel universes. Next slide, please. As Brian Greene, famous, but I can pick a million of them, physicist, puts it, any rigorous materialist must concede that, quote, a physical system is completely determined by the arrangement of particles. It follows that, quote, again, Brian Greene, if the particle arrangement within which we're familiar were duplicated in another patch of the universe, another cosmic horizon, that patch would look and feel like ours in every possible way. That means that if the universe is infinite in extension, you're not alone in whatever reaction you're now having to this very view of reality. There are many perfect copies of you out there in the cosmos, feeling exactly the same way as you're feeling right now in this lecture. And there's no way to say which one is really you. And so every possible action, every choice you made, and every option you've discarded will be played out in one patch or another. I hope you realize how anti-Christian this is from what I've argued. Strikingly, this is exactly what Blanqui said first. And he was not a Columbia PhD in physics. Quote, each one of us possesses in the infinite extension of space an indefinite number of doubles who live one's life in exactly the same way that they live. He, or the pronoun, is infinite and eternal in the person of other himself. It's a beautiful phrase and very quasi-Derridian. Il est infini et éternel dans la personne d'autre lui-même. Here there's a moment of difference, which we can talk about it later. Doctrine of eternal return of the same, therefore, entails a conception of eternal life, just like the Christian one, except that we eternalize ourselves not in ourselves, in the purity or singularity of our soul, as the Christians believe, but in and through our avatars in parallel worlds. The next sentence.
Yeah.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah. But, no,
One more.
Charlie Brown.
Okay.
But how then do we avoid Charlie Brown's horror and disgust at the idea that every human being is eternal in every second of their existence? This is a quote from Blanqui. Doesn't this view of nature damn us to repeating our present unhappiness and our misery eternally, which would be the definition of hell itself? And yet Blanqui saw written in the stars also a different message. Never to give up hope, even when we're living in capitalist hell. Each one of our lives is not only lived exactly like we live it forever, but it is also lived by some of our avatars in a slightly different way than we are living it today. And that version will also be lived like that forever. And I quote Blanqui, this is how he ends the book. Let us not forget that everything that we could have been here on Earth, we are actually somewhere else in the universe. End quote. The eternal return really is that form of hope which exists only for the hopeless, those who have abandoned all belief in progress and the immortality of the individual soul. Now, Benjamin was actually the first, probably still the only, important Marxist theorist to take up Blanqui's challenge. He posed the question, how can the messianic hope tied to communism be preserved within a cosmic vision characterized by entropy and eternal recurrence? He thought that nature could be understood as history, so that's the revolutionary moment, only if one takes seriously this thermodynamical cosmovision. As you know, Benjamin objected to the Marxist conceit, not of the classless society and not of class struggle, but of the idea that humanity will attain true happiness at the end of historical progress. In his famously obscure and mystical theologico-political fragment, he expressed himself as follows. He said, quote, God, which is classless society, is not the telos of the historical dynamic. Classless society cannot be established as a goal of history. From the standpoint of history, the kingdom of God or the classless society is not the goal, but the end, the terminus. Cut. Expressed in secular language, what he meant is that the true messianic figure of classless society does not result from a vision of technological and economic progress. Not in the Stalinist version, but not either in the Silicon Valley accelerationist view, who now believe that the messianic condition can be attained by the superintelligence of artificial intelligence, of AI. Rather, for Benjamin, the messianic image of redemption brings about the classless society comes when a revolution pulls the emergency brake on historical progress by telescoping all of past history into a moment of today, or in a Jetztzeit. I think one can perhaps render this very difficult thought through a cybernetic image. Benjamin considered that revolutionary politics was a kind of built-in negative feedback mechanism that would take as input the whole past history of the vanquished, of the defeated, in order to countersteer the capitalist drive towards progress, which is always imposed by the victors. And this is what I think he meant to say, that the task of historical materialism is to rub history against the grain. The question of what Yu Hui and others are calling cosmotechnics and its relation to the Marxist problem of how do we understand nature as history is essential to Benjamin's revision of Marxist philosophy of history. There's a cat there. What's going on?
Hey, can we just mute us?
Yeah,
How do we do that?
you just go to the top of whoever doesn't have the mute on and just mute it.
Oh, that's not too bad.
Yeah.
See if I get it right.
But it's nice to have the cat in the background. Cat.
Can
Cat
they
that
hear me
captures the
still?
mouse.
Yeah, they can hear you.
Marx and Lenin.
I'm muting it.
Cats of history.
Yeah.
The mouse.
All right.
One more.
Yeah, we'll get him worked out.
So, in the thesis on history, Benjamin cites Marx's famous opening lines to the critique of the Gotha program, according to which social democracy always falls into the mistake of ascribing the source of all wealth and all culture to human labor, and in so doing discounting the contribution of nature. Because if human labor were really the source of all value, then by definition, all technological progress and domination of nature to increase productivity should be seen as equivalent to advancing the interests of the working class. Benjamin thought this is manifestly false. For Benjamin, the social democratic understanding of progress is premised on the belief in the reality of the arrow of time and its irreversibility. Quote from Thesis 13, "The concept of humankind's historical progress cannot be sundered from the concept of its progression through a homogeneous empty time, and a critique of such progression must underline any criticism of the concept of progress itself." If you believe in progress, you're a social democrat, you're not a communist. Simple. I shall argue that contemporary natural scientific speculations on the relationship between entropy and life offer the materialist basis for precisely such a critique of the irreversibility of time, of linear time. Now, the mistake of social democrats is that they equate technological progress with human progress. Social democracy, Benjamin says, recognizes only the progress in the mastery of nature, not the retrogression of society that comes with such mastery. Thesis 11. However, Benjamin is no Luddite. He is interested in the possibility of using technology to move against progress. This would be a use of technology that increases, not decreases, negative entropy in nature. As we know from Schrödinger, Prigogine, and contemporary biology, the phenomenon of life is possible only thanks to the heat gradient of entropy. Too close to the sun, we fry. Too far from the sun, we freeze. What life does is to maintain itself at the right temperature by sucking in information or pattern matter, or free energy, what's called technically, from its environment and reorganizing itself, regenerating its cells, and so on and so forth. Information is negative entropy. If entropy is the reason for the arrow of time, then life's generation of negative entropy can be considered a detour or a deferral, or Stiegler will call it a difference from the arrow of time. This is why I think Bernard Stiegler is correct when he argues that, quote, establishing the question of entropy and negative entropy for human beings is the crucial problem of daily human life and of life in general, and ultimately of the universe in its totality, end quote. Borrowing an expression from Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics, Stiegler considers the possibility that technology, as long as it is understood as an immanent techniques of life, can contribute to the localization of anti-entropy, that is life in itself. So technology need not be what creates more disorder and entropy, but can also be used in a certain way, techniques of life, to generate negative entropy. Indeed, he says, negative entropy is the local slowing down of the increase of entropy through the organization of life, that is, by its exosomatic pursuit of organogenesis that induces a new regime of entropic deferral. Exosomatic means any creation of organs that are outside our body but that generate negative entropy. But what is the principle of the production of negative entropy? I don't think Stiegler ever worked it out as far as I can tell. So let me return in conclusion, or less, to Benjamin to see if one cannot say something more about the new basis on which our technical relation to nature ought to be placed. So, what is this messianic cosmotechnics that Benjamin is after? In the theologico-political fragment, Benjamin gives a cosmological expression to this Marxist idea of natural history, which is, again, to remind you, it's not the historization of nature. Sorry, it's not the naturalization of history, but it's a historization of nature, thinking nature itself as history. And he gives an image for this. He says, quote, if one arrow points to the goal towards which the secular dynamic acts, and another arrow marks the direction of messianic intensity, then certainly the quest of free humanity for happiness runs counter to the messianic direction. But just as a force, by virtue of the path it is moving along, can augment another force on the opposite path, so the secular order, because of its character as secular, promotes the coming of the messianic kingdom, end quote. This is a very difficult passage. I think what he means is the following, and it's a rather simple idea. The goal of our secular dynamic, of our worldly activity, is basically the material happiness of a free humanity. And that's the goal that is shared nominally by capitalism and by communism. It is a dynamic, but this dynamic towards material happiness is exactly what turns history into second nature, reifies our activity. Capitalism, as Marx also admitted, massively propelled humankind along this path and continues to do so in an accelerating fashion. So we're accelerating our drive towards material happiness. But the question is, what is the contrary arrow of which Benjamin speaks? The messianic force that turns nature back into history. Our material pursuit of happiness inevitably accelerates our downfall along the heat gradient, thereby increasing entropy. And this is what Benjamin meant when he says that in happiness, all that is earthly seeks its downfall, and only in happiness is its downfall destined to find it. Because obviously in our pursuit of happiness, we dissipate more energy than we generate, and life runs out in and through the arrow of time. Now, in 20th century cosmology, I think, there are two pictures. There's a picture of two fundamental principles that are kind of playing themselves out in the universe. The first one is gravity. Roughly means the tendency of matter to clump up together and heat up. And the second is entropy, as the irreversible tendency in closed systems for matter to spread out and cool down, eventually reaching thermal equilibrium where no further changes make any difference. Temperature gradients seem to be made possible by gravity, which fabricates stars out of gases and then planets, heats them up until they die out, collapse into themselves, swallowed by black holes. Entropy is the universe's way to achieve a lost balance and respond to gravity. Indeed, entropy might even be said, although this is a pessimistic view, to generate organized forms of life precisely because they are much more effective consumers of free energy than disorganized matter. As Freud understood, in other words, the drive to keep alive and the death drive are deeply intertwined. Our own metabolism entails the destruction of other self-organizing beings. Unleashing Eros might just be the universe's most efficient way to reach most quickly the sought-after stage of equilibrium or death. Now here there's a polemic against Marcuse, who thinks that Eros can defeat Thanatos. It's remarkable that Benjamin employs the language of opposed cosmological principles to illustrate the messianic role that revolutions play in countering the entropic downfall that is embedded in our pursuit of material happiness. Is there in the universe a messianic arrow that works against entropy and which is therefore ultimately responsible for regenerating life out of death? As far as I can tell, physics has not yet resolved the tension between gravity and entropy in one fundamental narrative. We do not know how or why, in the vast expanse of the infinite universe, which is roughly in thermal equilibrium, some cosmic patches experience a fluctuation such that a spike of low entropy and free energy appears, as if out of nowhere, in order then to begin its lively descent into thermal equilibrium and death. But some cosmologists these days suggest that thinking gravity and entropy together might require, as we saw with Brian Greene, adopting the idea of eternal recurrence. My hypothesis is that if life really entails a phenomenon of negative entropy, then the principle of eternal recurrence underpins negative entropy. Now, and here I have to go a little bit into the physics, but hopefully it's not too bad. The possibility of negative entropy was first conceived by Clerk Maxwell in a thought experiment which is called Maxwell's Demon. Can you put the second cartoon? So first peanuts, and then no.
Again, left term here.
You do it, Michael.
Yeah,
It's
you got it?
frozen.
No,
Oh,
it's
it
not. It's not working. Right, it
Yeah.
doesn't work that way here. Let me show you.
Okay.
All right, sorry about that.
All right.
Is that what you
no,
want?
but go ahead. There we go. Maxwell's
Yeah,
Demon.
Maxwell's
There's a
Demon,
ribbon there. So in a closed box divided by a partition with a very small opening, there is a gas in equilibrium, with some particles randomly going slower and others randomly going faster. In comes Maxwell's demon, a being who can perceive when a faster particle is coming towards the opening from one half and lets it through to the other, while keeping the slit closed for slower particles, thereby conversely letting out slower particles and keeping in faster ones in the other half of the container. And all this without needing an external energy source. It would then come to pass that heat is generated from cold, and entropy would have been countered, at least for a while, because eventually the demon gets tired. That was the discovery of Peter Szilard, but only very late.
Right.
All forms of living organization, we believe today, somehow seem to be animated by Maxwell demons. So people think that enzymes operate as Maxwell demons and so on and so forth. And the demon of eternal recurrence, of course, that haunted Nietzsche is also closely associated with Maxwell's demon. As it turns out, shortly after Ludwig Boltzmann gave a statistical mechanical interpretation of the second principle of thermodynamics and of irreversible processes, objections were raised that gave a scientific and mathematical foundation to eternal recurrence. So this is quite striking that, on the one hand, people are arguing for what's the basis of irreversibility, and immediately people are arguing that irreversibility doesn't really exist, that we're caught in eternal recurrence. These are the so-called reversibility paradoxes. And the first one is attributed to Boltzmann's department colleague, Johann Loschmidt, It's typical, right? You come with a brilliant idea and your department colleague shoots it down the next day. It basically states that it's equally probable by the reversibility of mechanical laws that atoms could exactly reverse the momentums that led them initially to spread out and thus to cool down the closed system. This reversal of all the particles would move the total state of the system from a high entropy back to a low entropy without any additional external source of heat, thus negating the second law. Loschmidt's objection to Boltzmann is that the reason why we only and always experience an increase in entropy, for example, no one seems to experience the omelette, once you've broken the egg, reverting back to a whole egg, that this phenomenon that we take to be basic for us is actually only due to us having arbitrarily chosen an initial condition of low entropy. Obviously, because to make an omelet in the first place, you need a whole egg. So the whole egg is, lower entropy, and the omelet is higher entropy. However, Loschmidt's point is that there is no physical cosmological reason based on statistical mechanical laws of nature why the universe should start out with whole eggs and evolve into omelets, rather than start with omelets and evolve into whole eggs. Benjamin's messianic arrow allows omelets to change back into eggs. To deal with Loschmidt's paradox and maintain the reality of the arrow of time, contemporary physics introduces an extra assumption, which is termed the past hypothesis. Namely, that the hypothesis that the universe must have begun in a low entropy state with whole eggs, which we call the Big Bang, and is inexorably smashing these eggs and moving towards a high entropy state, or the heat death of the universe. What is fascinating to me, at least, is that contemporary physicists recognize that this boundary condition that accounts for the arrow of time as we experience it is, quote, actually not part of the laws of physics themselves. This is really fascinating. For Sean Carroll, a leading contemporary physicist, the only reason we never seem to experience the arrow of time running backwards and only experience it moving from past to future is precisely because of this past hypothesis. Without it, we will only have illusory memories of having evolved from an ordered past, and our existence would become a cosmically scrambled affair. We would lose all hope of forming a coherent self, a story, you came from there and you're going towards there, and a coherent life story that gives us meaning. The question is, why should the universe be so structured as to make all too human aspirations to coherence and meaning necessary? Or does the universe care about our paltry needs for, biographical sense? Isn't this the assumption that Nietzsche ridiculed in the passage cited at the beginning of my talk? And what happens if we do suspend the validity of the past hypothesis? Most physicists today seem to agree that what happens then is that Blanqui's and Nietzsche's eternal recurrence of the same becomes the central principle of reality. The recurrence of the past as the future and of the future as our past unscrambles and repairs the ruins left behind by the arrow of time. However, the price to pay is that we have to give up the illusion of coherence in our lives and the illusion that we are a unique individual self. As things stand today, Carroll admits that the past hypothesis cannot, quote, save us from the problem raised by recurrence. I love that. Even the physicist says, we can't be saved from Nietzsche. And Boltzmann himself may have acknowledged that the eternal recurrence of the same is a valid hypothesis if considered statistically. On this scenario, it is not only possible but necessary for random fluctuations out of equilibrium to exist if only one waits long enough. This means that the amount of entropy is time and space variant. The universe overall rests in equilibrium, but in certain regions of space-time, there do occur random fluctuations towards lower entropy states, which then evolve back to the equilibrium of higher entropy states. It's as if in a frozen universe, in certain parts and in certain times, the universe would jolt itself for a brief time out of death and back into life, and do so repeatedly. Kind of Frankenstein universe, if you know what I mean. The fluctuation that happened in our patch of the universe and placed us on a heat gradient from low to high entropy must necessarily have entailed an inverse transition from high entropy to low entropy. That means it must have involved the backwards flow of time. In this reverse fluctuation, Carroll says, stars and galaxies would unform, omelets would turn into eggs, objects in equilibrium would spontaneously develop substantial temperature gradients. What I'm trying to say is that this is the image of a revolution. This is what a revolutionary event is, right? Capitalism tries to freeze us, freeze history, right? Thermodynamic equilibrium, but it cannot statistically eliminate these events in which the dead resurrect, so to speak. Here we can see that the reversal of time, or eternal recurrence, becomes a necessary condition of the possibility for the emergence of life in the universe. The cosmic ground of negative entropy, I think, might be a cosmological candidate for that messianic cosmic arrow of which Benjamin speaks in his fragment. How are we doing with time?
Oh, it's, we've been close to an hour now. Yeah.
Oh,
So go ahead.
okay.
You can, yeah.
Shall
It's
we-
very interesting, filled with many things we can discuss for the next
two more
10
pages.
years, next 10 years.
I'm nearly done. I'm nearly done.
It's incredible,
Okay,
man.
yeah. Very, very, yeah, go ahead. please.
So-
All right.
Yeah, no rush.
What does this cosmological interplay between entropy and negative entropy mean for philosophy of history? In our headlong rush towards the future, impelled by our desire to be most alive and for the longest possible time, we are consuming as many sources of free energy as possible. In effect, we bring ruination to nature, substituting our technological progress for its creativity. What justifies this destructiveness to nature is a belief that meaning, satisfaction, and therefore happiness lie always ahead of us in a future. I think that what Benjamin sees as the task of communism is not only to arrest this entire process, but actually to call it back and therefore awaken the dead or resurrect the flesh, as Adorno says. Communism has only one messianic task, and that's restoring the past of nature and nature to its own past, which is what it means for nature to become history, rather than the Christian idea of bringing heaven down to earth, or of replicating Jesus Christ's form of eternal life. Now, the most obscure claim in Benjamin's theologico-political fragment is this one. He says, the spiritual return to the beginning, restitutio in integrum, which introduces immortality, corresponds to a worldly restitution that leads to the eternity of downfall. And the rhythm of this eternally transient worldly existence, transient in its totality, in its spatial but also temporal totality, the rhythm of messianic nature is happiness. For nature is messianic by reason of its eternal and total passing away. End quote. Very obscure. But however, if we take entropy to correspond to an eternally transient worldly existence, which makes sense, then the spiritual return to beginnings, which introduces immortality, would correspond to a negative entropic process, in which every present moment would open the possibility for a return to and of the past that would reverse the temporal horizons of past and future, birth and death, origin and end. And this is a possibility that I think is vouchsafed by the principle of eternal recurrence. In one of the last fragments that we have from him, Benjamin wrote that the eternal return is an attempt to join two antinomical principles of happiness, the principle of eternity and the principle of once again. Although redemption is not attainable in and through the progress of time, and our pursuits of worldly happiness will lead inevitably to self-destruction, the principle of eternal recurrence, in strict contrast to the Christian idea of eternal life, indicates that the place of messianic salvation is not to be found in another world, heaven, that is radically different from our worldly life. As Benjamin says in another place, our image of true happiness is made up precisely of constellation of events that could have happened to us, but didn't so happen during our life. I think it was, so the matter of our happiness is not what happens, because we're unhappy. What happens is only unhappiness. But happiness is what could have happened in us if things were slightly, but only very slightly different. It doesn't mean a complete radical change. I think it was Arendt who understood actually this idea best when she argued that, contrary to our inclination to hope that happiness always lies in the future, contrary to our innate desire for a happy end to all our stories, we should actually realize that happiness is only a construction of memory. Quote, "The knowledge of a possible existence of our happy life is given in pure consciousness prior to all experience." So it's a memory, it's a Platonic idea. And this knowledge of the possible existence of happy life guarantees that we can recognize the happy life if we should encounter it, end quote. Agamben had a similar intuition. He says, to be a true historical materialist is to be ready at any moment to stop time because you hold the memory that our original home is pleasure, in the sense happiness. Happiness is something we remember, although it never happened to us, and we seek to experience it again. It is our faculty of memory that allows us to turn back from future goals towards past origins. And in presenting the past and thus depriving it of its bygone quality, memory transforms the past into a future possibility. Last part, and I'm done. Can you put the picture of Taylor Swift, please? This is selfies.
Good, you made it.
Sometimes it's just
Sometimes it works.
temperamental.
Okay.
Just as upon glancing at old photo albums that recapitulate our lives, when you look back at your old photo albums, we're unable somehow to avoid thinking of our happiness in a virtual past that never actually came to pass. As surely as you were not actually happy when all those photographs were taken. So too, the messianic form of communist action does not push towards a future life of eternal happiness or fulfillment, but flits through the images of the past in order to land on the one that realizes in the present the happiness virtually promised by the past of our natural history. Like Blanqui's eternally repeated avatars, our present becomes eternal in and through its infinite variations. The universe of the eternal return, says Blanqui, is an alternation, an oscillation, a perpetual exchange of renaissances, rebirths, through transformation. If, as Stiegler has argued, the techniques of life, of any life, in the cell, in ourselves, is inseparable from the capacity of memory, from the retention of the past, then the proper use of technology, its communist use, will take the form of redeeming nature, of helping nature attain its messianic state, allowing the arrow of time to run in reverse and eternalizing every one of the fleeting and contingent moments which were otherwise destined for destruction and meaninglessness. Messianic reality really is nothing other than our own reality, just slightly shifted into a negative entropic configuration. if communism is underwritten by entropy, as I've been trying, sorry, if capitalism is underwritten by entropy and communism by negative entropy, the difference between them is as minimal as that between our actual life of misery and the happy life we have always been living virtually. It's the memory of this happiness of humanity that nourishes revolutionary consciousness. Communism is not the end result of historical progress. It's the possibility of infinite variation in every historical moment. We are always eternally returning to the moment of re-beginning. Excellent. And last quote, just to end it off, Franz Kafka said, as you know, there is an infinite amount of hope in the universe, just not for us. End quote.
Very good. Thank you, Miguel.
Sorry, it was very long.
It's okay. It's filled with ideas, etc. I just wanted to add a quote that I wrote to Jeremy during your talk. That Albert Camus said, "I opened my heart to the benign indifference of the universe."
There we go.
So very nice to follow in your
right.
Kafka quote.
That's
as
right.
well. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I would like to, of course, open it to questions.
Yes.
There are at least, 20 to 30 dissertations that one could, again, take from the margins here. Very thought provoking, a great experiment. We can get rid of all the stuff and bring up just get rid of
We can keep the selfies.
Yeah.
I want to talk about selfies.
You
I'm
wanna talk
obsession with
about
selfies.
selfies?
Yes.
Okay, anyway, I just wanted to see if anybody had their hand raised and all of that. So why don't I open it to questions? I mean, at least for me, Miguel is opening up a very different kind of temporality for Marxism, to think about this and think about historical materialism temporally and not only as, progress or backwardness, etc., this kind of linear version of time, or time as arrow, right, etc., that I think is very embedded in much of the physics that you're reading today. As part, we can talk about this as well, the cybernetic revolutions
Yes.
that have occurred. So why don't we kind of keep that in mind in the background? But I'd like to hear from people if they have questions or comments. It doesn't really matter, yeah. Whether
Or things that went too
Yeah.
fast or
or
confusing.
too
Yeah,
fast or
anything really.
confusing. It's a very dense paper. Of course, there are arguments one can have with several of the positions, but again, it's an excellent, descriptive, analytical, and I think critical piece on the tradition in many ways, the Marxian tradition, if you will. Yeah, using some of the best tools that have been given to us by the thoughts of everybody from Benjamin, to Bernard Stiegler's, in my opinion, advance on what the communism of the future could be, and the use of techniques. But yeah, there we are. Yeah. So anybody,
Yes.
Good.
How would
This
you?
is Teddy Jefferson, by the way. A lot of people don't know Teddy who are on the list, but
Nobody.
Teddy's an old friend. Yeah. Some people, we know,
In terms of the ideas that were generated around the time of entropy, because in the way it's discussed, it's as if entropy and negative entropy are cited as if they're primary ideas, that because they come from nature and are so-called apparently physically true, that therefore they can be applied to the human world. But if looking at entropy merely as an idea, how do you relate its generation, its intellectual generation, its conceptual generation, to the ideas that surround it in that period of time, say, after the French Revolution? I mean, entropy, the term itself was 1861, but you get it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a very good point. I think you asked with what ground do I want to project or employ categories of natural science into a discourse, which would be a human science or social science, and we're talking about revolutions and all that. And I think one has to do it sort of carefully, of course, right? One has to do it carefully, but I try to say that the problem that Marxism had at a certain point, this is according to Benjamin, but also to Blanqui, right? Is that there was a lot of talk about history, but very little talk about nature, right? And the reason I think is because this talk about history was taken over by a conception of progress driven by technology and mastery over nature and control of natural forces and so on and so forth. And in my argument, this has led us to the crisis that we're in. So these Marxists were trying to say, look, if we really want to open up history, right, we've got to return to a different conception of nature, right? And of nature as inherently historical, right? And entropy seemed to be and is really the only good candidate because it gives to nature a kind of irreversibility, a kind of historicity that it was previously lacking. So Newtonian nature does not have a history. Nature comes to have a history, so to speak, for us through these discoveries in the 19th century, right? Now, the question, though, is that the history that is given to nature is one of linear temporality, irreversibility. But these revolutionaries, they needed to push back against this irreversibility, right? This is what's striking. I didn't make this up. This is what's striking that you find Blanqui, who is the Che Guevara of his time. That's what Marx says. This guy is the ultimate revolutionary. There's no other, Blanqui basically invents class struggle. Lenin admits it. Everybody that Marx says this idea really properly comes from Blanqui. He's very, very important, and it's just fantastic. And is it a coincidence that his Last Testament is a kind of cosmopolitical treatise? So I'm trying to understand that to show both how this kind of physics emerges in a kind of form of society in a special historical period. So it is historical, but it also has anti-historicist value. So I think there's a complicated discourse to have here about historicism, right? Historicism means that the value of something is just tied to the period in which it was thought, that it has no validity outside of those periods. And these thinkers that I'm alluding to, they're anti-historicists, that Marxism somehow needs to have a trans-historical validity, right? And I'm trying to say that it's the trans-historical validity of Marxism is rooted in a different way of thinking the relationship between nature, history, and technology, right? That's a little bit where I'm going to.
It's a very ambitious experiment and project, in the sense, because where we're getting now in the Marxist tradition, John Bellamy Foster being the latest example, is this return to Marx's dissertation on Epicurus, right? And trying to develop a new kind of, relationship of Marxism to nature and the dialectics of nature, to put it in Engels's term, right? This is limited, though, in the sense. Yeah. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm trying to say is that physics and natural science is part of society. So it's not surprising that you can have aspects of physics that are speaking to revolutionary discourses in that society. So I'm trying to generate this idea. It's the practice of science and its discourse is not independent from the dialectic of nature and history that is fundamental from Marx's perspective.
Well, I was almost asking whether you would go further and say that the notion of entropy was in fact the smuggling into physics of ideas that were profoundly humanistic.
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, there is that, but yes, that's in a way what I'm trying to say. But what I'm also trying to say is that we're not alone. You know, we are we are physical beings. All our mind, if you're a materialist, everything that we think must be somehow possible and necessary within a physical explanation, ultimately. It doesn't have to be a reductionist, but unless you're a Christian, you think that your body and your soul somehow comes from beyond the cosmos. That's what I mean. Beyond the stars, you must also have a materialist account of the conditional possibility of your own thinking. So in other words, it's not just that physics is a product of a certain society and it's purely a human thought, but it does have reference to something which is more than human, which is, you know, cosmic or physical, and that is acting through us and in us.
Jan Svankmayer's film Faust, which is the puppet synthesis of Marlowe's Faust and Goethe's Faust, actually, I'm 100% sure, has a scene where the omelet reverts back to the egg.
Right.
Is it?
Yeah,
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's pretty great. Would Vico not work for you with this brilliant, amazing framework? Because the repetitions that he charts are already patterned, so they're not up for that indifference you were talking about, or
Yes. I
Yeah,
mean,
you know what I'm
I think there is, that's what Arendt was trying to
Yeah.
say, is that, you know, in modernity, we have one modernity, which is very linear, very progressivist, but there are anti-modern or counter-modern voices, even modernity, it's also in Hegel, in Nietzsche, in Vico, that insist that we shouldn't lose the cyclical aspect,
right.
the recurrent aspect of history. And that's what I'm trying to mobilize, why that is, right? So, you know, if Christianity pushes us to think that salvation or happiness or meaning, whatever it is, it's always future oriented, these are the voices of saying that happiness is always found in the past.
Yeah.
And that it you know, it must be possible, or in a revolutionary action, you're trying to, in fact, relive a past that was always virtually there, but was never actualized.
From others, yeah. Yeah, Ben, please. Yeah.
I guess here I'm interested in like the kind of naturalization of history and the historization of nature. And with like,
Yes.
I'm thinking of the idea of, you know, communism as the end of the prehistory of man, like if that's reconcilable with this, but also like in the idea of, I can think in a way, like, is it true, like, you know, kind of capitalist social relations naturalize and like reify history and like,
Yeah.
is it kind of the idea of getting beyond history as a kind of external form of domination, form of like, you know, eternally true, like just forward moving thing kind of conceived as natural and kind of reclaiming it and like, you know, kind of I guess like not in a totally humanist, like making the entirety of history, but like redirecting it not towards a like idealization of the past, but like kind of taking and redirecting elements of the past is kind of
Yes. Okay. So from the bottom back, yeah, it's not a question to say no past by definition is perfect or happy. There is no golden age, right? By definition, because everything that happens is ruined, right? But still, the possibility of putting together the pieces, of finding some kind of redemptive motive, is still not to be given in the future, but is by going back to the past, right? And in Benjamin's sense, the going back to the past means that you resurrect something that was repressed, or the losers of history. That's what you're looking to connect with, right? Not the history of the victors, so to speak, right? That's one idea. Yes, the question of prehistory is complicated. It's complicated on many different levels because Marx does have a progressivist rhetoric. So, you know, the history of freedom is going to be the end of prehistory and so on. But he also has many passages in which he says communism, you know, will be a kind of reiteration of primitive communism with variations. But there is this kind of primitivism is a good word in Marx. This becomes even more so towards the end of his life when he starts to study, what Althusser will call, and everybody else, the uneven theories of development. So the whole global South, non-European Marxism is premised on the fact that the idea that revolution will come only and first to progressive industrialized societies is false, right? That's false. That's already a critique, an embedded critique of the theory of progress, right? Without it, we wouldn't have Lenin, we wouldn't have Mao, we wouldn't have anyone. And Marx, in his later notes, this is another way in which his primitivism comes out, that in fact he finds that revolution will actually happen in social formations that are, from a European perspective, considered to be backward, that they will actually be the forefront, which it turned out to be correct in many ways, right? So that's another dimension. And finally, yes, I mean, in a very stupid way, I'm trying to say that, what capitalism does is naturalize history. That means it tries to freeze our capacity of action and change and innovation and so on. And this corresponds to entropy, though, right? So entropy here stands for what Lukács will call a reification, right? Of history that becomes nature because it's reified. We become things, and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do we turn this back, right? This is what Adorno and Benjamin say. How do we, not from history to nature, but how does nature itself get history put back into it, right? And that's where I consider negative entropy comes in, because you need a kind of reversal of time to do that. That's a little bit roughly the idea. Now, what does it mean to act against reification? And here I think eternal recurrence and a doctrine, a logic of repetition is very, very important. I think all of French philosophy around 68 and afterwards, they're all, we had this discussion, they all return to this logics of repetition, of iterability and Derrida and so on. Well, why is that, right? Why is that? All I'm trying to say is that logic of iterability is one answer to what Benjamin is trying to think about. How can we think nature itself as historical? And my second point is that exactly what we're talking about now with the Gaia hypotheses and Chakrabarti and everything, the planetary view, is exactly that, is nature as a historical force. But that means that we are not the only historical beings. And in fact, the possibility for us to make history might require us to really engage nature as a truly historical agent.
Spinoza.
Among other things.
Among
Other things. And one last thing.
Yeah.
I alluded there to a kind of theory of the self. And I said that our idea of coherent self is tied to a notion of irreversible time, right? It's only when we can say, this is our past, I was born from this mother, and I did this and this things, that we can have a kind of story that we tell about ourselves. And the only thing that I'm trying to suggest is that if we buy Benjamin's picture, and action requires us to redeem nature, so to speak, and to reverse time, that means that we have to be prepared to sacrifice the coherence of our sense of self. So you can't be a revolutionary and coherent. It's impossible.
We're going to use that at departmental meetings in the future.
It's impossible.
I'm not a coherent.
But I think
No, it's good.
I think that I mean, translated in psychoanalytic terms,
yes, exactly.
This is very similar to what Deleuze and Guattari were after with a schizoid analysis, which is a schizoid self, which is the only access to a proper revolutionary action.
Even earlier with Lacan, there's no unified self.
That's right.
No such thing. It's a complete myth.
Yeah, speaking about this, if you can go back, Miguel, to the point where I think you were quoting Blanqui in French, the
Yes.
Louis Man, no?
Yeah,
And to bring back the quote that we had by Blanqui on the board, but that's very interesting, but I want to know if you can read that again.
yes, it's astounding. It's like Derrida, but
Really, yes, and say this. So the idea would be, right, I mean, that you reach with certain complex, as you say, sense of the self is not a complete, deconstruction of the economy of the self. I mean,
yes,
the other oneself.
yes.
Right?
So he says we are infini et éternel. We are infinite and eternal dans la personne d'autre lui-même, in the person of our other selves. So we will never be infinite eternal because we die. But in our other selves, we in the repetition, infinite variation of our other selves, that is the kind of eternity. So this brings me back to the selfies, right? It's a very interesting phenomenon. The phenomenon of selfie that young people and not so young people have. And I was always watching my daughters and my son, this thing that it's not take 10 pictures of yourself. I said, what is this? Is that on the one hand, it's a compulsion of repetition, right? I mean, it's very complicated.
Yes.
It's tied to
Sure.
narcissism.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but at the same time, what I'm trying to suggest is that the point is that we're trying to capture an image of when we are happy that doesn't exist. We're trying to capture virtual happiness. Something like that has to be reverse engineered, and that will be what the communist revolution is.
Manny, yeah, please.
Comment,
Yeah.
maybe a question. I'm
Yeah.
not any specialist in cosmology at all.
Me neither.
From a religious perspective, especially. I was wondering, taking your work a bit further, but by the way, it's very interesting and thought-provoking. If we were to conceive of the Marian idea as the imperialist idea,
Yes.
and if we were to see that as a negative form,
Yes.
a form of entropy, actually. And,
Correct.
Absolute form of entropy that perhaps today with the notion of degrowth
Yes.
that is propounded by Jason Hickel and others,
Yes.
we can see it's not necessarily a negative entropy, but it's a de-entropy of a certain type
Yes.
with respect to the fact that we, the imperialists, must
Yes.
live a more humble life or a life that's not as materialist, and we have to give it to those people who are the victims of Columbus.
Yes.
So I don't know if we want to.
No, it's completely. I mean, this is just this is one of many discourses that are bringing into economy circularity again, cyclicity, right? Because everybody's aware that the progress is ridiculous, right? Even abundancy theorists, sort of social democratic theories of abundancy, they also have a kind of eternal recurrent thing and saying, well, we're already there. We don't need to progress. It's just we have to change things around and make more of what we really want. And we have the capacity to generate this abundance if only we don't spend things in stupid way, progressive, capitalist senses and so on. So I think in generalized all over in economics, whether we speak of circular economy or degrowth or the many different variants.
But that's not going to ever happen. That would be my perspective.
You mean capitalism is the progressiveness is too strong?
Solidarity is not there. Happiness.
Oh well, yeah, well, yes, indeed. But I think why is it not why is it not there? And I think what it is because of Christianity. I'm trying to suggest that Christianity ties us to, as I said, a kind of idea that the happy ending is coming. The happy ending is coming, and we just kind of have to, as it were, persevere and progress until it happens, whether it's through AI or through some other means. And I think this idea is fundamentally destructive and does not generate the kind of solidarity that we need. It's complicated, but I think this Marian thing is important. It's an important insight that Sloterdijk and actually Schmidt, who first said it, it's very important. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's Hickman who writes a book on a critique of Christianity and the destruction of indigenous polytheism and paganism and all that. Jared Hickman, very important. Black Prometheus, it's called. That's a brilliant analysis of the Marian underpinning of the conquest and of globalization and colonialism and all that. But here, for my purposes, I just wanted to that I think Schmidt has a really brilliant intuition about in the end it comes to a very simple either or. Either you have faith that everything that happens only once, or the opposite, that is you adhere to eternal recurrence. I don't think there's any other ultimate. All the others are washed up versions. You can say you have a cyclical version of variations of progress, but at the bottom of progressivism is Christianity ultimately.
But it's interesting that the scientific model that inspired Maxwell and Boltzmann in terms of the formulation of entropy was Darwin, which is another model that was very big in the course in that century.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's but both, interestingly enough, both Darwinism and thermodynamics are physico-biological theories, but you can see their anti-theological animus, which was immediately perceived by everybody. It's quite astounding that as soon as these theories come out, it's immediately a question of natural theology, what we used to call it, right? It's immediately a polemic. Oh, Darwin, we come from monkeys, so God couldn't have created us, right? Thermodynamics, if we're all going to die in a heat death, right? Like Musk says, enjoy the journey. That's also proof that God doesn't exist. And at the same time, Nietzsche says God is dead. So I'm just trying to,
Or we're coming
to
to
this
Victor
connection.
Frankenstein as well, kind of prefiguration.
Now, the question, what's interesting with Darwinism is, the role of, on the one hand, the memory, the genetic memory that gets, that's the code that gets transmitted, and on the other hand, this capacity of all life to generate random variations, right? That's the moment of. You can read that as entropic, but there's also nowadays contemporary biology, I think, is trying to read back negative entropy dynamics into our understanding of evolution. Yeah.
No, maybe there is no better place to think about this than Anaximander's famous fragment.
Yes.
I can like to, recite, which is the things that are paired into the things which they come to be.
Yes.
Speak a little louder so everyone, I'm sorry, Bruno.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the things that are perished into the things from which they come to be, because they had to pay penalty and retribution for their injustice.
Yes.
And then it ends by saying, according to the ordering of time.
Yes.
That's beautiful, which is there. I mean, even now, today, with us, not only in, of course, philosophy, but Marco Rovelli, I believe
Yes.
that's his name, in the Order of Time, that
Yes.
book he goes back to Anaximander. That's maybe the most basic moment in the sense precisely of this cycle of things destroying themselves, coming back, but not as you were saying. I like that, not as they were, not in their individuality.
Yes.
That we have from the Christian, for example. No, the soul, the individual soul. Of course, everything goes into this kind of disorderly, whatever, new reality from which then other things come back. right? So
Yes.
that's the basic, which is beautiful. I believe that is really.
Yes. No, I agree. This
By the way,
this Anaximander, yeah.
Empedocles threw himself into the Etna, right? With the
Right.
Of course.
Yeah, but I went to the mountain just because of it.
But this, no, you raise a very interesting point that again, this connection between physics and philosophy that we we're just talking about. It's amazing how the modern physics, the quantum mechanics, how obsessed the founders were with ancient philosophy, right? Obviously because of the atomism. So atomism is a relatively new hypothesis that comes to be, Teddy, in the 19th century, but it just verifies the atomism of the ancients. That already is fascinating. What if you think about it? Well, what it means is that all the science of the modern was bad science. It was only when we return, right? And Marx was also when we return to the science of the ancients, because they were the true atomists, that modern science starts to get, purchase on the real structure of reality. That's amazing. That's already an incredible avowal. And so it's not surprising that Schrodinger and Heisenberg, after they make their big discoveries, they spend all their time writing about the ancient pre-Socratics and how it mirrors quantum mechanics. So what I'm trying to say is that there still hasn't, political theorists have not really reflected what is happening here. It's not just that physicists are doing it as a hobby to go back and read Heraclitus. Something else is being expressed that they themselves will not express it because they're not revolutionary political theorists, but there's something is being articulated that I think it'd be worth to think about it in political and economic terms. That's a little bit the gambit that I'm suggesting.
Jeremy, you want to say
No.
something? Yeah, I saw you.
Well, I was reminded that I was supposed to send you, and I will tonight, this essay that came out in the 70s called Einstein and Mao.
Okay.
And just to tell everyone about it. It was quite incredible. I mean, they really went deep into the quantum physics realm in the 60s and 70s. And then, I mean, it's different with Rovelli, but like if you kind of glam together all of those proper names of Benjamin, Du Bois, Mao, Einstein, Chou Enlai, like Mach. I mean, and it's absolutely incredible. I mean, the Bolsheviks and a certain kind of iteration of Chinese anti-imperialists are obsessed with the quantum revolution.
Yeah, and the question is, how to interpret that, right? So I mean, one interpretation is to say, well, the one naive way is to say, well, Marx's discourse has discovered the true laws of history, which are analogous to the true laws of nature. And so that's why they're obsessed in finding a reflection in the laws of nature that correspond to the true laws of history. Benjamin wants to do the reverse engineering of that, right? It wants to break down the assumption that there are laws of history, because that is just plays into the hands of capitalism. And therefore that requires then a kind of operation on our understanding of what is a natural law, right? And what is I find infinitely fascinating in the scientific production of our day is that, sure, there is normal science. So a normal scientist would say, oh, I didn't understand anything what you're saying, it's all bullshit. But that's because they're doing just, their little experiments and so on. But if you go to the fringes where the great scientists, the really innovative people, they're extremely obsessed with philosophy, literature, history, and they're operating on a revolutionary paradigm, to follow Kuhn, right? And here at this edge, whether it's Rovelli or anybody else, the question is ultimately to recover Einstein's formative idea that time is not really temporal. That is that, in a sense, as he says in a letter to Basso at the end of his life, time doesn't exist. So, and that is Spinoza's point, that reality is connected to eternity. But how to think that physically difficult. And I think that's why the obsession with black holes and what happens to space-time in those extreme moments of the birth and death of the universe is a very, religious, actually, theological political drive that physicists have that is unavowed and perhaps unavowable for them because differently with that.
No,
No, I was asking Bruno because I'm not sure.
just speak up a little bit if you
I,
don't mind.
I said I was asking Bruno before, but I'm not sure I understand the relationship between nature and history, because it seems to me that nature is historical by definition, right? So it's underlyingly historical, right? Because it's something that, first of all, even the word itself, nature, the etymology, when you think of it, it's something is born, because nothing is born, right? It evolves somehow, and that's history. So it's underlyingly historical.
Yeah, now I would say that is where what we've come to, thanks to whether it's Darwin or other cosmological theories, but from the kind of, let's say, a Newtonian picture of nature. It's a Newtonian picture of nature that is at the base, or a Cartesian, if you want, also, that is at the basis of the distinction between the natural sciences and the human or historical sciences, and a debate that goes on until the the 19th century, when the natural scientists start to say, you know what, it seems that phenomena that you thought were purely historical, like Schleiermacher or hermeneutics, right? That we're finding something that similar, so to speak, in our conception of nature. And that's where things get interesting, I think. Yeah. Yeah. And I, in a sense, I agree with you that also the early Greek intuitions, one can say that for them nature is already historical, and that's also the interest of us going back to these ideas. But the key is to bring back nature in history and as history, because capitalism does exactly the opposite, right? It naturalizes history, and so it actually freezes history.
Reasons.
Yeah, it freezes history. The thesis that I was trying to put forward is that secularism and secularization is actually a stretching out of a present that ultimately cuts us off both from an authentic past and therefore also an authentic future.
But history is natural too, right? How can you?
Yes, he's dealing, he's critiquing a linear conception of time.
Yeah, but I mean, naturalized, you cannot eyes nature. I mean, I know it's a word when it's used, but natural eyes is a strange word, right? You cannot make something natural, because that's what naturalized means.
Yes, but that's why that's the problem in Hegel and Marx of what then come to be called the second nature, right? History as a kind of second nature.
Right. Sorry.
And they were criticizing that history had become our second nature. And the argument is interesting. It's because we're stuck in a present. That means we have no contact with a true past. And that's actually what prohibits us from moving to an authentic future. We think that, yeah, we have a past and we're going towards the future. That's actually a frozen history. We are frozen in a present. And what is that present? That present is a Christian paradigm. That's the hypothesis.
Yeah.
You see?
And again, why Stiegler is so important in terms of tertiary retention, because that's really what he's trying to do, to get us outside of this, quote unquote naturalized time, And the first to really do this philosophically, and I think Miguel will agree with this, is George Lukács's great essay, Reification, on reification.
Yes,
Second nature
he is.
implies consciousness,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
Who's very well aware of the debates of the natural sciences, the social science, the human sciences.
Absolutely, yes.
The physical sciences.
Lukács argues against what everybody now accepts, that you can't divide the world in a set of facts and set of values.
Right.
He argues for the reality of both nature and history are tendencies. They're not, laws of nature like in a Newtonian. And all that he made purely thinking about literature, Prigogine and others are saying, yeah, you're right. Nature is only tendencies. Just like history
Yes.
is.
And the falling rate of profit is also a tendency. Right, exactly. Yeah. So
maybe the request, I don't know if someone has a question from
Beryl, are
very patient.
the lovely ladies in the house. You notice we're all men. We were expecting a couple of it's like it's like
can we Beryl, we can't
Beryl,
hear you.
Yeah, we need to unmute. Yeah, please.
What I've been thinking in a fairly muddled way is how this relates to the actual material deterioration of our environmental reality, and whether we can hope, in some way for a return to some previous state. Our belief in the myth of progress has pushed the physical reality to such a point that there is no hope. What's your view on that, Miguel?
Well, I agree. I think we have to. I think any hope that doesn't start from a radical hopelessness, just caught in a Christian narrative about faith and hope. The first thing, right? So I suppose we should. One way of saying is, what's the setting on hopelessness? What is the, and I think here that's where eternal recurrence is beautiful, because as Nietzsche first explained it, but also Blanqui, it always has two sides. One side is radical hopelessness. That is your and all of our ultimately miserable life, and the miserable life of the whole world will be eternally repeated in misery. So and Benjamin said that, right? The eternal recurrence is a perfect capturing of capitalist hell, both hell as capitalism, but there's a new book on climate change called Hell, and the world is heating up like we're in hell, and so on and so forth. So there's all that metaphorics and all that. But so that's the hopelessness setting about the recurrence and repetition. Or to put it in Freudian terms, there's no getting out of the compulsion of repetition. You can't just wish it away and say, oh, Eros will triumph, Marcuse. No, really, because that's what the people that I like also, but in the 60s, they were arguing that Freud got it wrong with Thanatos. And there's a way of explaining Thanatos away just by the logics of Eros. I think that's false. That's just false. It's so evident that we are inherently destructive beings, Thanatos beings. So that's the hopelessness.
But the idea of the death drive, the way that originated in Freud was not to kill or die, but rather to recede to a point before life, before the transition.
Yes.
That's a very interesting distinction.
But that is an entropic idea, because entropy is that. So that's what. Yeah. At least you can make people made connections that Freud's death drive is, as it were, can be modeled along entropy, which, as I was saying, right, most cosmologists think that life itself, it's a very pessimistic idea. that there is life, only because life is more fanatic. It's better at destroying things than matter. And it's true. I mean, this doesn't need to eat or suck up oxygen, or this generates less entropy than I've generated in this 1 hour. In fact, much less so, because it's not destroying anything right now. So it's a very interesting idea that that's a very pessimistic and hopeless idea, that in fact it's thanatos and entropy that's dictating the rhythm of life, right? And Benjamin still wants to hold some kind of hope on the basis of that hopelessness. But then that requires having a kind of discourse about, is it possible to reverse time? Is there negative entropy? What is its cosmological and what is its political condition of possibility? What is its psychic condition of possibility? Psychic, it has to do with memory. So, well, it's just one can operate at different levels.
And of
but
course, you can add to this Ernst Walk, the principle of hope, in another way too, the memory and the river, he goes through the river, the streams, right? Of memory too.
But I think Beryl, you put your finger on the right thing, because now everybody's talking about hope, because we are in hopeless times. So so there's a revival of thinking about hope at climate change and climate apocalypse.
By the way, hope is not a good word or concept.
Yeah,
that makes you.
It
blinds you. Yeah,
it's the last gift of Pandora. It's the last gift of Pandora's box. If we mythologize it and we talk about it, and maybe the most evil of all.
But for example, saying actually interestingly, in Spanish, hope, wait and hope are the same, right? And that's very interesting, because actually when you hope, you wait, you are passive. There is no agency.
Yes.
Actually, it makes me
waiting on Godot.
On the train, they say. The train gets stuck, and they tell you, thank you for your patience and cooperation, because to be hopeful means to be very patient. You are not an agent.
Yes, but that's because yes, it's true. But that again, it's you're always hoping for some either ex deus ex machina that comes in to save the situation, or that things will get better of itself, and so on and so forth. So that's why against this kind of hope, which is, I think, is a very Christian progressivist notion of hope, that progress or history somehow by itself will make things better, then you need to set things at a hopelessness default. And I'm suggesting that the eternal recurrence is that default of hopelessness. And only by traversing that can you get to a different, non-Christian, waiting, expectant, apolitical concept of hope. So there's a bad hope, if you wish, bad if you're revolutionary, which is a progress somehow, with AI or super intelligence or something will come out here that will save us. Then there's the default setting of radical hopelessness, which is what Kafka begins with, and Nietzsche and all that. And then where Bloch is, it's after you traverse that, is there still a different kind of hope? And what does it look like, and so on? So these are all open questions. But
Any other of our friends on screen? Beryl, you had some further remarks or thoughts about hope? Yeah, okay.
Hope is the thing with feathers.
Yes. Well, we go to dinner for the Turkish automaton, which begins the beginning of Benjamin thing. I'll read from Benjamin to kind of sum up some of what Miguel was talking about from the thesis on the philosophy of history, since I think some of his work is really coming out of this alongside the theological political treatise earlier, the fragment that Benjamin wrote early. Anyway, this is thesis 14. Origin is the goal, and is the epigraph from Karl Kraus, right? History is the subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now. Okay? Thus, to Robespierre, ancient Rome was a past charged with the time of the now, which he blasted out of the continuum of history. The French Revolution viewed itself as Rome reincarnate, right? It evoked ancient Rome the way fashion evokes costumes of the past. Fascism has a flair for the topical. No matter where it stirs in the thickets of long ago, it is a tiger's leap into the past. You know, as what we were saying earlier today about Pedro, right? About beware of the jaguar, he told Trump, right? The past. The jump, however, takes place in an arena where the ruling class gives the commands, right? The same leap in the open air of history is the dialectical one, which is how Marx understood the revolution. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll
Nice.
end the class.
Nice, yeah.
That was
Kind of
incredible,
something.
man. Thank you.
Yeah.
so
Well,
much.
thank you very much. So, sorry for, thank you for being
No
patient.
polemics tonight. You
Hi,
know,
Baron.
this is good. No,
Thank you.
yeah, great to see you guys. Thank you
Bye.
for coming. Yeah.